Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Baroque and Rococo art, specifically the Baroque in Italy as well as the Rococo in France. So the Baroque in Italy is about the 17th century, and when we were talking about late Renaissance as well as the Mannerist period, we talked about artists who were starting to exaggerate certain forms, using artworks as inspiration rather than nature as inspiration. So we see these trends continuing in the Baroque, but the Baroque itself has a bit more extravagance, theatricality, and emotional intensity. The word Baroque actually comes from the Portuguese baracho, meaning irregular pearl or stone. It's a metaphor for the Baroque period as being described as unique, one of a kind, desirable, beautiful. There's also a great emphasis on light, as well as the depiction of movement, not just in the forms of the figures themselves, but even in the drapery. As we can see here in Bernini's The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, we can get that sense of textures, of the softness of the skin, the jaggedness of the rock formation that they are situated on. Bernini, as well as being a sculptor and painter, was a dramatist, so he was versed in the theatrical genre. He was also a composer and an architect, so we'll see how all of those areas of study actually help him to create this altarpiece, or this is actually a funerary chapel that we have here. It was commissioned by a cardinal, Cardinal Canaro, within the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. Now, St. Teresa is a popular subject. She was a canonized saint, canonized in 1622. She is a Spanish mystic who often wrote about her visions. She has a book, actually, or there is a book that exists that talk about her writings. One of her most famous writings is on her vision when she sees an angel. So if you read along with me at the text next to the image, she is quoted as saying, "Beside me, on the left hand, appeared an angel in bodily form, such as I am not in the habit of seeing except very rarely. He was not tall but short, and very beautiful, and his face was so aflame that he appeared to be one of the highest rank of angels, who seemed to be all on fire. In his hands I saw a great golden spear, and at the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. This he plunged into my heart several times, so that it penetrated my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt that he took them with it, and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God. The pain was so severe that it made me utter several moans. The sweetness caused by the intense pain is so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease. This is not physical, but a spiritual pain, though the body has some share in it, even a considerable share." So what she's discussing here is finally reaching this moment of enlightenment, where she is being filled with the fire of God's love by this angel, presumably Gabriel. Many scholars have also discussed the undertones of sexual symbolism that represent this spiritual vision. She's explaining through a metaphor of her body as a physical experience. And so there's a relationship of the physical and the spiritual that Bernini is representing in stone. So taking a look at this image. Now, Bernini was a very religious man, as we talked about, and this is the period of the Counter-Reformation when you have the church and these people who are devoted to the church that are starting to commission these very emotive works of art. This is to dissuade people from converting to Protestantism, which was very popular, or made popular, by Martin Luther and the Reformation. So, visually, this is a very powerful piece. We can see the dynamic composition. You have very strong diagonals, hinting the sense of movement. The drapery seems as if it is in this kind of wind tunnel, as if it almost has a life of its own. The textures are very nicely differentiated, but the whole scene really just appears to kind of float in air. Now, Bernini's expertise in architecture as well as theater will really come into play for the construction of this entire altar. So we see in the Baroque period there is a difference from the Renaissance and the appeal to the rational. Rather than the appeal to the rational and the symmetrical, you have an attention to the emotional and the spiritual. So what we have here is Bernini using pomp and ceremony to give the viewer a dramatic access to the spiritual realm. So he's using his knowledge of theater, staging techniques, props, lighting, etc. He's using the whole space of the chapel, as well as he's carving relief figures in what are identifiable as theatrical boxes. So there's also a sense of witnessing in this event that is not just the viewer witnessing, but these figures carved in relief. The figures carved in relief, as you can see a detail of in the top right image, the figures are modeled after members of the Carnaro family, as they were the donors of the chapel. We see the rays of gold, as well as stained glass, being used to emit this sense of divine light. And when we get to painting, this sense of theatricality is also translated. Caravaggio was a very innovative painter. He also had a very tumultuous personal life, which ultimately led to his death. He specifically developed a stylistic technique called tenebrism. That's Tenebrism. So this is the dramatic use of intense darks and lights to heighten the impact of a painting. So think about in the first few weeks of class when we discussed the use of value and the Italian term for that, chiaroscuro. This is basically a chiaroscuro to the extreme. One of the biggest characteristics of Baroque art is dramatic lighting. So what we see here in Caravaggio's painting, Judith decapitating Holofernes, there is a very dark background. It appears that the figures are lit with a spotlight. As you can see, the bright kind of focal point of Judith with her white garment, and she is in the central beam of light. So the scene that we have going on here is actually a very famous biblical narrative. It's the story of Judith, who was a matriarch of a Jewish town called Bethulia. This Jewish town gets invaded by the Assyrian army, who is taking over at this time much of the Middle East, as well as moving into Syria, or what is modern-day Syria, Israel, and Egypt. So the story goes that Judith, in an effort to save the people from the terrors of the Assyrian warriors, goes to the general's tent. The Assyrian general's name is Holofernes. So what she does is actually coaxes him into drinking. He ends up drinking too much, which allows her to overpower him along with the help of her maid, and she severs his head. So we're seeing this moment being depicted in the painting here. So you have Judith, her maid is standing next to her with a cloth ready to catch the head in the bag, and Judith is cutting off Holofernes' head. So this is a very gruesome scene. We see the sword slicing into his neck, as well as the blood spurting out towards the viewer. But take a moment to look at how Judith is being represented here. What we'll see here is a little bit of differences in how genders or different genders represent the same subject. So Caravaggio is a man, and he's representing this subject. Now, this story is very female empowering. So when we're looking at this figure of Judith, she does not seem very powerful. She seems very disgusted with this image or with the action that she is performing. She kind of seems like she's touching something gross in the sense that she doesn't want to be doing this. So when we take it a different perspective, this is Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith decapitating Holofernes. So Judith, Artemisia was actually a female Renaissance artist, one of the very few. She was influenced by Caravaggio's use of realism as well as his techniques in tenebrism. Artemisia's father was also an artist, which afforded her the opportunities to learn from him, as women were actually not allowed to perform traditional apprenticeships. Only men would have been allowed to go and train with a master painter. But because Artemisia's father as well as her brother were artists, she was able to learn the techniques from them. So both of these scenes emphasize violence and a triumph of this unlikely character of Judith over the Assyrian general Holofernes. So Gentileschi's Judith, however, appears physically stronger, as well as more psychologically active in the murder. As well, take a look at how the composition is arranged. You still have that dark background, the figures are being pushed forward, but the bloody sheets are actually closer to the space of the viewer. The action is more bold as well. Look at how she grabs the side of his hair and his head, holds him down, and very forcefully drives the sword upward. So we're seeing that Holofernes is struggling more greatly. The maid as well is being portrayed not as an old woman, but actually as a woman that seems to be about the same age as Judith. So we see a different kind of feminine perspective where it ultimately becomes more powerful from the female point of view because it is highlighting this hero or a heroine who is a woman rather than a man in these traditional biblical narratives. So when we're talking about these kind of comparisons, I want you guys to take a look at both of these images side by side. You can pause the presentation and just take a moment to look at the elements and principles being employed here, how Caravaggio and Gentileschi are using the same elements and principles, but there is a difference depending on the perspective, whether we're coming from the perspective of a man or a woman. We'll also be comparing different styles in sculpture. So we can note some of the changes during the Renaissance into the Baroque by examining a story depicted by three great artists from this period. So the early Renaissance, when we discussed that, we looked at Donatello's David. We discussed the biblical story of David and Goliath, young Israelite who battles the giant Goliath in single combat. He fells the giant with a single stone from a slingshot and uses Goliath's own sword to cut off Goliath's head. So it's a triumph against a powerful enemy used as a symbol by later cultures, specifically Florence, Italy. So we see the story being depicted here as well as in Michelangelo's David. So let's just kind of recap just as a reminder of what we discussed in each of these periods. So Donatello's David in the early Renaissance, it is depicting the moment after battle. So David has won. This is also, if we remember, one of the first full-scale nudes in sculpture since antiquity. So the art is being inspired by the sculptures of ancient Greece and Rome. It revives ancient techniques of bronze casting as well as representing these youthful and beautiful depictions of the human body, so they are idealized. It is very calm and classical. The battle is over, victory is assured. So it has all the hallmarks of the internal balance and harmony that became so characteristic of the Renaissance. As well, we're seeing the use of contrapposto. The weight is on his right leg, left leg is relaxed. So he looks very similar to the classical Greek Doryphorus, or the spear bearer that was completed by Polyclitus. So if we look to Michelangelo, now this is characteristic of the High Renaissance, where artists begin to push ideas of the early period even further. So greater naturalism, movement, and detail. So Michelangelo's David was placed in a courtyard so everyone can see it, originally created for the city of Florence to celebrate the removal of the tyranny of the Medici family. We discussed how the Medici family were very prominent merchants who commissioned many artworks, but were also part of the corruption of the Catholic Church. So in the High Renaissance, now this is when the influence from Greek and Roman can really see kind of blossoming to its height. So what we see here, think back to those Greek and Roman sculptures that we talked about a few weeks ago. You have this classical athletic body, again modeled off of the Doryphorus or the spear bearer. But there's an even greater attention to the details of anatomy than Donatello. It's very clear that naturalistic depiction of the body was very important. And this is very appropriate as humanism, or the concept of humanism, is being integrated into Italian Renaissance culture, where man was seen as God's most beautiful and perfect creation. So the artist is being divinely inspired and can thus parallel this creation in art. So David here is depicted as an older youth, a young man, rather than the small boy that we saw in Donatello's version. You have idealized proportions, accentuated muscles. There is a tension in the face, but there is also a sense of stability. You have a strong vertical line. There's also mathematical ratios being used for the proportions. And the moment that's being depicted here is actually the contemplative moment before battle. So in Donatello's version, we have the moment right after defeat, right after Goliath is slayed. But in Michelangelo's version, you have this quiet contemplative suspense being created as David is assessing what he is about to do. Now, as the Baroque is characterized by this increasing amount of extravagance, theatricality, and emotional intensity, we see that shining through in Bernini's sculpture also of the David. So in Bernini's version, we see the figure of David is actually a very mature man, so not even a young boy or a young man, but a man who has grown to maturity. The time for contemplative reflection has passed. It is now the moment of action. So it is characteristic of Baroque art to depict the moment of the greatest drama and theatricality. So what could be more dramatic than the moment right before the stone is hurled to slay the giant? Everything in this story rests on this action. There's also an emotional intensity and heightened sense of movement here, mainly through the use of diagonal lines actually within the sculpture. Each of these sculptures are meant to be viewed in the round. the actions and details are revealed by our own actual dynamic movement around the sculpture. So it's echoes by the dynamic of the energy of the pose itself. So when we're taking a look at these sculptures, you have to imagine the sense that as your position is changing around them, your perception of what you're seeing is also changing. So for the final exam as well, you guys will want to be able to compare and contrast. So know the differences specifically of these three examples of the David sculpture, of the differences of Donatello's early Renaissance depiction, Michelangelo's High Renaissance, and Bernini's Baroque. All right, so now we'll move to chapter 3.7. So we will be continuing with the Rococo period. So there's a transition from the Baroque to the Rococo. In the early 17th century, there was a lot of warfare and political unrest. This resulted in France's emergence as Europe's largest and most powerful country. So 18th century European countries, at least for the most part, were governed by absolute monarchs. They believed that power and authority was derived from God, which was bestowed upon the king. Now, King Louis XIV, he was the king of France during the late 17th into the 18th century. His reign actually lasts for 72 years, so this was quite a long time to rule. He ruled as an absolute monarch, so all the power resided with him. He was even once quoted as saying, "I am the state," meaning that his authority is rooted in divine right, because the king's absolute power was God's will. He would also become known as the Sun King, self-proclaimed. It's symbolically recalling the Greek god Apollo, whose job was to usher the sun across the sky. So this puts the centrality importance on Louis as the center of the universe, and further asserts the power of the French kingdom. The French king was the preeminent French artistic patron. As we have seen with many different cultures, rulers knew the political strategy and propaganda of commissioning artistic works. He recognized the power of art to reinforce his image within the kingdom. He also employed a workshop of artists and architects. One of the most famous is Hyacinthe Rigaud, who would become the principal painter to the king. This is who painted his portrait that we're looking at on this screen. So this painting is a life-size, full-body representation of King Louis XIV. Now, Louis is the central form and the focal point. His face is turned to meet the viewer with confidence and directness. This emphasizes his authority as king. The environment as well, take a look at the setting that he's in, is also suited just for a king. We can see embroidered silk curtains that form this luxurious canopy. There's lavish carpeting. There's a marble column atop a gilded base of gold. And his pose as well literally allows him to look down on the viewer. So we are automatically made into his subjects. So even though that this is a painting, this is not the actual king standing in front of you, it is so realistic and so purposefully constructed that it gives the viewer that sense of the need to submit. Painters as well would make portraits of the rulers, but of course the rulers wanted to be represented a certain way. This is what we call self-fashioning. You didn't have photographs that would reveal the truth about how the ruler actually looked. You would actually have to see them in person to verify the appearance of them. So this was not something that was available to the everyday person. So images could be fabricated to portray a certain image of the ruler however they saw fit. So we're seeing this come through in Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV. Firstly, there's the illusion of height. French monarchs were actually notoriously short. Louis XIV himself was 5'4". So his hair, if you take a look at his hair, is actually risen high above his head, giving the sense of height. But also take a look at his feet. Now, ladies, you may be or may not be, depending on if you enjoy wearing heels or not, actually upset with Louis XIV of France, as he actually invented high heels. Originally, high heels were worn by men, and specifically the French king to increase his height. So we're seeing Rigaud is appeasing his patron by employing idealized elements at the expense of realism. The king himself would actually die 14 years after this portrait is complete, but take a look at how he is represented here. He is shown physically trim. He is beautiful and powerful. The hair, look at those calves though. This suggests a vital and vigorous man at the height of his power. So every detail, down to the coronation robes, reinforced the idea of power of the French monarchy and the divine authority of Louis himself. The detail to the left edge of the painting also shows us that we are located near the famous Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The king loved it so much it was placed over the throne so that in the king's absence the painting served as his proxy. So again, Rigaud was so successful at arranging this composition to make its viewer subservient to Louis's image that it even served in King Louis's own physical presence. So what's just an interesting tidbit as well, the courtiers of Louis XIV were actually forbidden to turn their backs to the painting. When you address the French monarchy, you would never turn your back to them. So because this painting was so realistic and Louis loved it so much, it likewise had to have the same respect as the king. Many of you may have heard of the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was actually originally a small hunting lodge. It was transformed into an extremely lavish palace suitable for Louis XIV, and he moved his entire court out of Paris to Versailles. So this is the kind of start of the excess of the French nobility. And Louis embodies this concept, which would later lead to the French Revolution, when you have people who are starving in the streets of Paris while the French monarchy wastes money. So this served as the official court to Louis XIV and his friends, family, courtiers, servants, and soldiers, about 20,000 people in total. It was created by the leading architects and designers of the time. The structure itself is quite vast. It has 700 rooms, 2,153 windows, and occupies 67,000 square feet. Now this is the equivalent, for those of you who know about football, the equivalent of 12 football fields. So the massive structure would actually include elaborate gardens. You can see them in this image behind the structure itself. The design was essentially classical, reaching back to Greco-Roman architecture, so you have this attention to symmetry, repetition, and based on these simple elements borrowed from ancient Greek temples. So the use of classical architectural styles is used here to remind people of the greatness of the classical past. So the time of the Greeks and Romans were considered, at least during the 17th century, as the root of the intellectual and aesthetic superiority of the West. Thereby, replicating this type of architecture is a metaphor for the superiority of the French nation. So the design itself even becomes symbolic, meant to emphasize, of course, above all, Louis's importance. The palace as well and its gardens were built along an east-west axis, so it allows the sun to rise and set in alignment with his home, also reinforcing his own nomination of the Sun King. So the Hall of Mirrors in the Chateau de Versailles, this is a very famous part of the palace. It's often depicted in paintings. It is used as a ballroom, a greeting area, as well as an art gallery. It was used as a passageway for the king to walk to his private chapel after he woke up, and it would have been packed full of people waiting for a chance to ask the king for favors. It was also often used for parties, including the mass ball for the wedding of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and even later as settling for military agreements. Actually, the Treaty of Versailles was signed here in 1919, which officially ended World War I. So the space itself includes 17 mirrored paneled arches. These visually expand and extend the room because the mirrors make it appear larger than the space actually is. So these illusions using mirrors is a characteristic of Baroque interior architectural design. The exterior is the palace gardens, and this period can really be marked overall by extreme decoration, from the wall decor to the doorknobs to the cornices. It would also have originally been filled with elaborate furniture, such as gold and silver chairs. This palace, with its sumptuous decoration, fueled by the extreme wealth of the French monarchy, would be enormously influential on the development of the Rococo period. So, as an artist in the 17th and 18th centuries, the grandest paintings of the 18th century were often seen in the salon exhibitions. So, this operated under the authority of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture. It was founded in 1648 under the rule of Louis XIV, or the Sun King. It provided training for artists and a platform to exhibit their work. During this time, the salon was a dominant public entertainment for the city and was actually open to the public. It kind of acted as a visual spectacle. In this image, or this drawing that you can see here, the exhibits were actually packed with paintings from eye level to the ceiling. The quote-unquote salon-style exhibition in current practices refers to this type of method of hanging art, literally stacking it from floor to ceiling. Surviving accounts talk about the ceaseless waves of visitors that would come and see these artworks. So these salon exhibitions operated under the authority of the Academy, and they followed a very strict hierarchy of genres. The hierarchy of genres would be defended by successive generations of academics into the 19th century. However, the control of the salon jury ensured a certain rigidity to the selection of works. So the system of rank is based on the traditions of Greek and Roman art that were established during the Renaissance. It elevated specific types of painting, mainly through awarding prizes, scholarships, and spaces or studios in the salon for artists. It also had a significant impact on the perceived monetary value of artworks, particularly when auctions started to occur. So the top bracket is history painting. This represented the culmination of all skills learned in the academy. It was typically on a large-scale canvas. The subject matter dealt with classical, literary themes or events throughout history. Examples would include Judith beheading Holofernes by Caravaggio, and later David's Oath of the Horatii, which we'll see when we view realism and neoclassicism. Next, you have portraiture, especially large-scale or full-length, as we saw with Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV. This was very expensive and often done in a classical pose. So the classical pose is used to give the sense that the sitter or the person being portrayed is heroic or noble. Many artists would make a living from smaller commissions for portraiture. Next, you have genre painting. So genre painting would be scenes from everyday life. So think back when we talked about artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was working in the Northern Renaissance, what is modern-day Netherlands, and would depict these scenes of everyday life with these religious subtones. Next, you have landscape. These would usually be horizontal paintings that dealt with the natural world. Then you had animals. Portraits of animals were second to portraits of humans, as humans were, again, God's finest creation, in that line with the philosophy of humanism. And the very bottom bracket was still life painting. Still life painting was considered the easiest type of painting as it contained no living subjects. It's easier to represent a vase that is standing still than a person who moves. Mostly small-scale canvases were used for still life painting. So the Rococo period, in the 17th and 18th centuries, this is especially popular in France. So power and extravagance of the European ruling classes. So now consider the decadence of the French nobility we just examined. So this would also in turn inspire a period of extravagance among the wealthy in France. So kings, wealthy merchants, and the upper class began to be more important than the clergy. So the commissioning of art resulted in less religious images. So this is an era of the last rule of the nobility and monarchy before the French Revolution as well. So the Rococo has certain stylistic characteristics. So you'll want to know these to be able to identify what is a Rococo painting. These include light-hearted subject matter. Sometimes they are whimsical and flirtatious, often ornamental, elaborate, and opulent. There's a lot of organic shapes and lines, very, very little geometric shapes, with the exception of circles. You also have these very pastel colors of these soft pinks and greens, blues, golds, whites, very minimal black, but used strategically to create that sense of depth. So if we go to Fragonard's The Swing, this is kind of the epitome of the Rococo painting style. I want you guys to take a look at this image for a moment. So take about 30 seconds, take a look at this image, let your eyes move through the canvas, and think about perhaps what is the subject matter here? What is happening? What makes you say that? So go ahead and take 30 seconds. All right, so hopefully by now you've had a moment to be able to kind of assess what's going on in this situation. So firstly, what we're seeing here is a bit of a flirtatious encounter. So now follow along as I'm describing what's happening in this scene and see if maybe you perhaps came to the same conclusion. So the woman is obviously the focal point. Her billowing, fabulous garment. She has a very elegant hat, silken stockings. She's sitting on this red velvet swing, and she actually kicks her shoe with a mischievous glance to her lover, who's actually hiding in the bushes. So we see this quote-unquote gentleman below. This is a sort of naughty scene, as if you can see where the gentleman's line of sight is, it is directly up her dress. So in essence, he is not supposed to be there. So he remains hidden, at least to all except for his lover, who is the woman in the swing. What's interesting here is that the older man actually pushing her in the swing is interpreted as being a Catholic bishop. So he is either oblivious to what's happening, he does not see this lover in the bushes, or he is actually supportive of the encounter because the church is corrupt. So this could actually be a judgment on the church's role in society. As well, take a look at the surrounding scene here. So these are higher class individuals. We can tell that based on how they are dressed. And we see that we're on some type of landscape. So it appears to be woods, but there are sculptures. There's some type of architecture that you can make out in the distance. So we know that we're not too far from civilization, but there is still a sense of the vegetation being lush and overgrown, that there is a sense of abundance and growth. The artist Fragonard is also using atmospheric perspective to create this dreamlike sense where the light tends to dissolve into the forms. So if we move a little bit closer, now I want us to focus on the statue of Cupid that is represented just above the lover's head. So if you take a look to the statue of Cupid, you can actually see that he's putting his finger to his lips. So this is suggesting that the relationship between the lover, the male, and the female is actually a secretive relationship. There's also two putti, P-U-T-T-I, or Cupid figures that are directly below the dress of the female. And these are perhaps actually holding a beehive, so you can see that they are both kind of holding one another as well as this object beneath them. So this is interpreted as being a beehive. So this could possibly be hinting to the sting of love or pleasure. If you take a look in the lower right, there's actually a tiny little white dog just next to the foot of the bishop. Dogs, as we saw with Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, are often a symbol of fidelity. So the dog, as it is depicted barking, is perhaps protesting to this encounter. Or he could even be trying to give away the secret hiding place of the lover. And overall, what we see here is the indulgence and expression of pleasure of this scene is very much indicative of the French aristocracy at this time. So this type of painting of the Rococo period, the painting about pleasure itself, would become criticized in later art and thinking or philosophy of the Enlightenment, which occurs around 1789. So the Enlightenment, where mode of thought is separate from religion and tradition. So there's an emphasis on rationality, there's a promotion in scientific questioning. This time period is also eventually epitomized by the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. The quote-unquote final revolution that begins in the latter half of the 18th century that created the economic and social upheaval and change rather than political change. So this revives an interest in Greece and Rome, just as it did in the Renaissance, and this is where we will also see the rise of the artistic genre known as neoclassicism. So in France, in the 18th century, you have a period of revolution. So French Revolution overthrows the French monarchy. between 1789 and 1799. You also have the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. So let's take a look at how the Revolution is dealt with in reference to Marie Antoinette. So by the late 18th century, the wasteful spending of the upper class, and especially the monarchy, had caused popular opposition. So these are the kind of early murmurings of the French Revolution. Some instances, the monarchy used art to try to appeal to the people and show that they were not as frivolous and were rather more serious. So we see again an artist or a ruler trying to use art as a tool for political propaganda. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun was another female painter. She was a female painter favored by the Queen of Louis XVI, who is the famous Marie Antoinette. So in this painting, we see a scene inspired part by a shift in art that looked back to classical Roman ideals, but also visually symbolized by a return to simplicity and naturalness. So, especially the ideals of the Roman family. We talked about the creation myth of Rome with Romulus and Remus, where Remus sacrificed himself so that the state of Rome could still exist and prosper. So it's the idea of sacrificing oneself in service of the state. So this is the same idea that Marie Antoinette is trying to promote. So we can see the French royal family in this sense. Marie Antoinette is represented here with her children. She's depicted as a devoted and beloved mother, and it's signaling that she is a wife. At least the perception of women in this time is basically in her place in the home. So this pose is infused with a sense of quiet dignity that is appropriate for her stature. So this image is also meant to appeal to the viewer's emotions, mainly for the time period that she existed in, but it also would appeal to the emotions of someone who was a mother in contemporary times. So what we see here, you have Marie Antoinette centrally placed. You have the youngest child in her lap, her younger daughter, who is to her right, and her young son is at a crib that is empty, and he is pointing his finger at this empty crib. So this is hinting that the youngest child had actually recently died in infancy. So Marie Antoinette is trying to give this sense that she has lost, and as was the case in the 18th or 17th and 18th centuries, many European women, or at least women in general in the world, had difficulty giving birth. So, unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, or at least if we go to this image here, we'll see that she is trying to hint at her status as a mother. She's also trying to pull away attention from the extravagant lifestyle of the monarchy. And unfortunately for her, this was a little bit too little, too late. France itself at this time was on the edge of financial collapse. Most of the general population actually blamed the extravagant lifestyle of the aristocracy. Many blamed the queen herself and had rumors about her life. And what we see after this painting was done in 1787, 2 years later, France would be plunged into revolution. The artist, actually, Vigée-Lebrun, would flee France, and the queen herself was famously beheaded at the guillotine. So for April 20th's lecture, We will be covering what kind of art emerges after this revolutionary period. So we'll be looking at neoclassicism, romanticism, and realism. So please review the PowerPoints for your homework. Remember that your museum essay is due tonight on Blackboard, so make sure to go ahead and submit that. Please give yourself plenty of time. Remember that sometimes Blackboard gets a little bit funky. If everybody is trying to submit their papers by 11:59 p.m. or right at that time, it tends to glitch, so please give yourself enough time to submit it, as there will be no late exceptions. Also remember to compose your single-spaced page of notes, at least one page, for today's lecture, and the hard copy will be due at the beginning of class on Monday, April 30th.